Hello, and welcome back to another one of our drunk pub rants, where today we have another topic. The RMS Olympic, the forgotten older sister. Now, there's a lot of things April is known for, particularly today's date, the 14th of April. Because that is the date that the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg 113 years ago. There she is. However, what is often forgotten is Titanic was a middle sister. And today we're going to be talking about her older sibling, RMS Olympic. Now, there are actually three of the Olympic class liners: Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. If you're wondering why Britannic looks very different to the other two, that is because she was finished in 1914, meaning she was immediately pressed into service for the British Navy during World War I, where she acted as a hospital ship until she struck a mine off the coast of Greece. Now, in December 1908, the construction started on Olympic. A few months later, construction would start on her sister ship, which you can see next to her there. Both of them, of course, unnamed yet, but that second ship would be Titanic. On the 20th of October 1910, she would be launched, and by the 29th of May 1911, she would start her sea trials. On the 31st of May, she'd make a quick hop across from Belfast to Liverpool, where she'll be registered under the White Star Line, before, on the 3rd of June 1911, arriving in Southampton, where, between the 14th and the 21st of June, she would make her maiden voyage between Southampton and New York City, with 2,301 passengers. The trip would go off without a hitch, and she would go on to continue having a undamaged career for the next 4 voyages. However, on her 6th, on the 20th of September 1911, she would collide with the HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser, off the coast of the Isle of Wight. Luckily, no one on board was injured or died during this incident. There was just a lot of damage done to both ships, and, well, remarkably, both the Hawke and Olympic would be repaired. Then we get to the 14th of April, 1912. The Titanic incident. Now, at the time, Olympic was returning back from New York City when she received a distress call from the Titanic, claiming that they had hit an iceberg and was sinking from the bow, and only had about an hour left until going under. Olympic was one of the furthest boats away from Titanic that night. However, due to her size and speed, she was able to be the first White Star Liner ship on the scene. This put her after the Cunard ship, Carpathia, who was the first to arrive. Being of the same company as Titanic, Olympic offered to take the passengers. In exchange, it went something like this. The reason Carpathia refused to give up Titanic's passengers to Olympic was fairly simple in retrospect. They thought the sight of a ship near identical to the Titanic arriving mere hours after the Titanic had sunk would cause a lot of distress for the people who had, just survived a gigantic ocean liner sinking. Which Olympic was fine with. They just decided to instead be the ones relaying all the messages back to the White Star Line, confirming the loss of Titanic. And every time Olympic would pass over Titanic's sinking spot, they would hold a minute's silence for their fallen sister. Now, The sinking of Titanic caused a bit of an uproar when Olympic docked back in Southampton. None of the crew wanted to go back on the ship until she had major refits to prevent it from becoming another Titanic. These strikes lasted from between the 25th of April to the 15th of May 1912, and eventually, on the 9th of October, Olympic was returned to Belfast for these said repairs. And she would stay in dock until March 1913, where she would return to civilian service, at least for the next just over a year. Now, if you know a thing about dates, you'll realise that something rather major would happen in 1914, that being the start of a little thing called World War I. And during said conflict, Olympic would, while she was going around the coast of Ireland, hear the distress call of a British warship, the HMS Audacious, which she would rush to help. She would arrive too late to actually save any of the passengers, the troops on board. However, there were other warships in the area that heard the call and came to help. However, Olympic being there led to a little bit of an outrage given she was a civilian liner, and civilians had just seen this rather embarrassing loss for the Royal Navy. And so, the Olympic was interned in Lough Swilly between the 27th of October to the 2nd of November in 1914. However, by the 2nd, with this incident making it to the press without the Olympic, she was allowed to return to Belfast, where she was to wait out the war. However, of course, that wasn't to be the case, and the Navy conscripted her to be a troop transport in May of 1915. In this new role, Olympic would ferry Canadian and then later American troops over to Europe and the Mediterranean to fight in the war. Another thing that was done was all of her civilian fittings were removed to give room to the military stuff, including, guns and artillery. She was also repainted in dazzle camouflage. Now, how that works is all of these confusing shapes will make it harder for an enemy ship to determine how close or how big the ship is because of all these confusing lines making false horizons and such. Then, on the 12th of May, 1918, as the war was beginning to wind down, the Olympic does something completely based. Now, she spots a German U-boat, U-103. The U-boat notices the giant ocean liner and decides to dive, to get away, or to attempt a sneak attack. Despite being, a giant fucking target, the Olympic decides to ram the U-boat. And she almost cuts the submarine clean in two with her propeller blades. For this, she gained the moniker Old Reliable, which she would hold for the rest of her career. With the war over, on the 25th of June, 1920, Olympic returned to civilian service after yet another refit. This refit basically invalidated her funnels, allowing her to work off an electric motor. They had a cinema installed, just general, for the times, upgrades for a ship that was built over a decade ago at that point. Now, while she was no longer the biggest or the fastest ship, she was still a luxury liner and attracted crowds such as Marie Curie and at the time, Prince of Wales, Prince Edward, later King Edward. However, the Wall Street crash and the resulting merger between the White Star Line and Cunard led to, well, a depressing decision. Olympic was to be scrapped, and on the 13th of October 1935, she was towed to Jarrow, where, over the next few years, she was slowly taken apart, and her steel was scrapped. A rather depressing end to a great ship. Now, I don't think I really need to explain why I've brought this topic up, given, well, Olympic was the only one of the White Star liners of the Olympic class to actually have a full career. Titanic, of course, sunk on her maiden voyage after hitting an iceberg. Britannic never got to be a civilian liner and sunk in service as a hospital ship during the First World War. Neither of them actually got to have a full career, but Olympic did. And I find it rather depressing that Olympic's story isn't that well remembered, given how, well, important her story is, because it can tell us a lot about what would have likely been the legacy of Titanic and Britannic if they had not had their fatal incidents. Now, I'm going to end this with a minute's silence for the lives lost 113 years ago. Over 1,500 people died in the sinking of RMS Titanic. Again, I thank you all for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, and all that other good stuff, and I will see you next month. Goodbye.